Subscribe to our YouTube channel for in-depth interviews of India Inc. and press the bell icon so that you do not miss our updates.
Hello and welcome to Nirmal Bang, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Hiral Dadia. We have with us Mr. Suyash Chaudhary, Head Fixed Income at IDFC Asset Management Company, joining in. Welcome to the show, Suyash, and always a pleasure to speak to you. My first question coming to you is with regards to where the recent RBI monetary policy goes. They have continued to maintain their accommodative stance. The signals that everyone's picked up yet is that there would not be any further rate hikes, at least for the time being. What do you make of the entire scenario so far?
So first of all, thank you for inviting me, and most sincere apologies for the delay. We had a hardware problem. My computer had crashed, but always a pleasure. As far as the RBI is concerned, people were broadly expecting that sometime starting this calendar year, they will start a normalization cycle, which would have entailed them slowly bringing up the reverse repo rate from the 335% that it is at currently. Now, till very recently, most people would have thought that this normalization would begin sometime over the mid of the calendar year. But as you know, we are in the midst of a very unfortunate and very severe second wave of COVID, which has led to renewed disruptions in economic activity. And therefore, we think to some extent, RBI's normalization process has been somewhat delayed. So as things stand, people would largely expect that somewhere in the October to December quarter, the RBI may start to hike the reverse repo rate. But importantly, one has to understand that this is most likely going to be a very gradual process. It is very well defined by the RBI governor that they want an orderly evolution of the yield curve. And the way the RBI seems to be progressing about this, or whenever the time comes, is that as they start to hike the reverse repo rate, they will also probably make sure that the hike is not transmitted up the curve on a one-to-one correlation, which means that not every 25 basis points of the reverse repo rate hike should translate into, as an example, a 25 basis point rise at the 5-year point. So to that extent, they will probably continue with their Operation Twist, OMO, and government bond intervention programs, so that even when they start to reverse the level of the overnight rate, it's a gradual process, and the disruption up the curve is mitigated to some extent. Now, this does not mean that yields will not go up, but it means that given that the yield curve is already very steep, the bulk of the heavy lifting will probably be done by the very short end, starting at the overnight rate. But it's important to emphasize that the process is probably delayed. And on its own, the RBI can afford to wait. There is one other aspect with respect to international developments that one will also have to think about, whether those force the RBI's hand to some extent or not.
Right. So with this, how do you read inflation as well as growth, Suyash? Because clearly, the kind of recovery that we picked up, at least from the third quarter onwards, yes, it could have probably continued in the fourth, but it seems that April, May, June will bear the brunt. We could see some bit of negative growth that could come in yet again. How bad could it be? And with this, how important is it for the RBI to ignore inflation? And do you think will they do it?
So, the base effect from last year is very large. People would have broadly expected for the current financial year somewhere around 12% real growth rate. They will now be downscaling it by 100, 150 basis points over a period of time. I mean, some forecasters were more conservative. The RBI itself was around 10.5, if I remember correctly. But some of the forecasters who were more optimistic will now have to start to prune this down. Look, we don't think on domestic growth inflation trade-off, the RBI will have to make any meaningful reversals in policy. So like you said, there is a hit to economic growth. Yes, there is an element of imported inflation that one is feeling because globally commodity prices have risen very sharply, but that will largely show in WPI inflation this year. And you will see some very nasty readings on WPI inflation. If you see CPI on the other hand, there are 2-3 factors that one needs to keep in mind as far as CPI is concerned. One, CPI inflation had already risen very sharply last year because of idiosyncratic factors, because of some very severe congestions in the supply chain. So you'll remember there were readings last year where CPI had touched 7% or beyond, just as economic growth had collapsed. So the first aspect is that there is a base effect on CPI, which is conducive for lower readings this year. The second aspect is that the element of imported component of inflation is that much lesser in CPI. So last year, we saw CPI averaging, somewhere around in excess of 6%, whereas WPI was averaging somewhere around 1%. This year, the roles will be reversed. WPI will be much higher and CPI will probably be in the 5% area. The third aspect also to remember is that there has been a very substantial knockout effect on wages. So, purchasing power generally, where marginal propensity to consume is larger, which is in the, weaker economic sections of the society, their purchasing power has taken a substantial dent. So fundamentally, if you were to look at inflation drivers, yes, there are cost pressures. Yes, there is imported inflation, but whether this translates into second round effects on inflation, which means this inflation gets generalized, it doesn't look likely that is going to be the case. So as far as CPI alone is concerned, we would think RBI can manage somewhat of a 5% kind of average on CPI, given that we are now in a truly flexible inflation targeting regime. So we are no longer in a regime where RBI used to de facto target a point on inflation, which was 4. Now I think, broadly, they are happy if inflation averages somewhere in the 4 to 6 band. Like I said before, the bigger challenge, if at all, can happen from imported tightening, which means that, as you know, the US is in the midst of an exceptional fiscal experiment. They have roughly, injected a fiscal stimulus, which would be twice the amount of output they would have lost over COVID, even accounting for opportunity cost that they lost. And therefore, there is a view that, the US economy can throw up significant inflation. As of now, the Fed doesn't think this is going to be of a durable nature, and therefore they are happy to look through it. So far, the markets are in some sort of a balance over there, where one round of inflation repricing has happened over January and February, but now markets are waiting and watching for incremental data to come through. Now, so long as data does not further exceed expectations, I don't think there'll be too much of a problem of imported inflation. But there's always a risk that US data actually starts to meaningfully surprise even the lofty expectations that currently exist in that market. And if that were to be the case, then there is a small risk that some repeat of what happened in January, February can happen. But let's be clear, that is not the base case that we are operating with. So the base case is that the curve is steep, that there are points on the curve which allow for meaningful carry to be had, even allowing for interest rates to rise, and that RBI should be able to unwind policy in an orderly fashion. But this is a risk that is very much on the table.
Right. So, Suyash, with this, as we know that the government, in fact, the central bank announced a 1 trillion government securities acquisition program called the GSAP 1.0. How do you think it will actually impact the bond market as well as the Indian rupee? And how good a move is that?
So, there is some sort of a love for narrative that our markets have. So when the GSAP was announced, a lot of commentary happened around, a view that this is a very large departure from previous RBI policy, that this is a very large expansion of balance sheet and that it will hurt the rupee, etc. We don't think it's anything as dramatic as that. The only thing the GSAP does additionally is it commits to a certain number of, on the OMO purchase program, which is even outside the RBI's own discretion. So to basically give you the example, they said we will do 1 lakh crore over the quarter, and they said we will do 25,000 crores on a particular week. Now, what the deputy governor clearly stated is that even the RBI cannot tweak with this. So it's kind of an upfront commitment to the market, unlike the previous OMO programs, which were more of an ad hoc nature and where the discretion always rested with the RBI to change or modify the amount under OMO. But as far as the effect on RBI's balance sheet is concerned, nothing changes. if you'll recall, the governor had already kind of assured the market that they will be doing at least 3 lakh crores of bond purchases during the course of the financial year. The GSAP amount is very well within the limit of that amount. And it does not, in our view, entail any extra expansion of the RBI's balance sheet. So to be linking this to depreciation of the rupee is probably not right at this juncture. One will still have to wait and see. As far as the effect on bonds is concerned, the bond market is really working under an assumption that RBI will almost do what it has to for the orderly evolution of the yield curve. Now, what you have to clearly understand is that the orderly evolution of the yield curve does not mean that the RBI is targeting a certain yield, right? So the orderly evolution of the yield curve can very well mean that yields go up over a period of time, which is most likely going to be the case. But what the RBI does not want is a disruptive change in yields, which then leads to a reversal of the transmission and destruction of risk appetite in the market. So we think they would be happy if yields go up over a period of time in a certain methodical fashion. And that is really what the RBI is trying to engineer in.
Right. So with this, when you talk about the bond market and the RBI right now, in fact, the RBI governor really made it clear that the central bank is going to support and is ready to support the government's borrowing program. Now, with this support, what is the kind of impact that you're expecting with regards to where the fiscal deficit is concerned? Because clearly, if you go to see, the current account returned to a deficit of almost $1.7 billion of GDP in the third quarter of FY21. And this was somewhere against what the street was actually expecting.
Look, so we have found historically the current account actually is notorious for turning very fast. So it has happened before, when the economy had briefly slowed down earlier, in the 2010 to 20 period, somewhere in the 2015-18 period, where, the current account actually had started to turn very sharply. So, to rely on a current account surplus for an extended period of time on a view that investments have fallen and savings are in excess sometimes does not lead for a very good projection, because there is a lot of quirkiness, for want of a better word, for the in the current account progression. Having said that, if you see the state of the savings investment balance in the country, it's very unlikely that we move to a current account situation that becomes troublesome to manage. So typically, if you're running 2 to 3% current account deficit in the context of a country like India, it is largely manageable. You'll recall that in 2013, we had hit 5% current account deficit, which was a very large danger warning sign. And we had to kind of pay the price for it when RBI had to dramatically raise rates to control that. Right, but as long as current account stays in the 2.5 area, it is quite manageable. The other thing one has to note is that there is a shift in the way the RBI runs its forex reserves and the currency policy. So last year, they have actually been very, very proactive to absorb most of the dollars that came into this country through the FDI and FPI route. And you know that there was a very substantial accretion to our forex reserves as a result. Had the RBI not been so proactive, the rupee would have appreciated more and the extent of our forex reserve buffers would have been much lower. Now, this year, as some of those dollars have left over the last 1.5 months, the RBI is not supplying all those dollars to the market, leading to some amount of currency depreciation. So what they are, in our view, very smartly doing is to build a very large FX cushion when the dollars are coming in. But when they are going out, they are allowing the rupee to be some sort of a pressure wall, allowing the rupee to depreciate rather than bleed your FX reserves to the same extent that the dollars are leaving the country. So this gives them a little more buffer to be slightly more lenient as far as inflation and the current account deficits are concerned. But that can only be done to a certain amount of reason, not beyond that.
Right, so taking the current government account into consideration, do you think there is a likelihood of the fiscal deficit undershooting the revised estimate of 9.5% of GDP for FY21?
So, one of the things, in fact, the hallmark or the defining aspect of the union budget that just went by was a massive cleanup exercise that they have done on the subsidy items. So you'll recall that over a period of time, a significant portion of subsidies were now getting financed by below the line items like small savings. So what happens then is that if the subsidy is directly financed by the government of India, it shows as part of the fiscal deficit. But if you're financing subsidy through other routes like small savings, then it doesn't, that part does not show as part of the fiscal deficit. So one of the things that they did is they brought all of this on balance sheet, and therefore they have spent a lot of money cleaning up the subsidies. So they have spent a lot of money earlier in the year cleaning up arrears on fertilizer subsidies. Then in the union budget and in the month of March specifically, they have also used a significant part of the expenditure budget to actually upfront retire the small savings dependence that was being channeled for food subsidy to Food Corporation of India, etc., and brought that on balance sheet. So that 9.5, 9.8 or 9.2 becomes that much more difficult to forecast depending upon what portion of that subsidy burden they have chosen to retire. But the general sense is that they have not aimed for further consolidation for the financial year that just ended. They are happy to stick to the numbers presented, so around the 9.5 area, but using that space to further clean out especially the food subsidy item. So even this aspect is very, very important. And so people have largely said that the budget has focused on capex spending. It's not. So if you see the amount of additional capex spending, although on year terms it will look quite impressive, but as far as the additional amount is concerned, it's quite modest. The bigger achievement of the budget is this massive cleanup exercise that they have made. They have retired a lot of their arrears, including to whatever payments would have been pending in their own value chain. So a lot of liquidity has been released into the system that way, into their own supplier value chains. And they have created fiscal flexibilities for themselves, because at the point of budget, they even projected tax revenues for FY22 quite conservatively. So now that economic growth is dipping again, some of that conservatism will actually come in quite handy to them. So for the first time in many years, the budget as an exercise actually was kind of ahead of this problem of perpetually wanting to save some money because your tax assumptions fell short of or the actuals fell short of what you were assuming.
Right. So Yash, with all of this, what again becomes important is with regards to what the RBI is going to do, especially with regards to where the bond market goes, because that's something which is having a direct impact on how an investor really needs to look at the debt market. Now, the treasury bill purchases that they've done, do you think that they're suggesting that they're actually preparing to conduct a wider operation twist, number one? And number two, do you think there is a possibility of higher bond sales in the coming weeks? And if that leads to higher yields, the RBI would have a good amount of ammunition to deal with the rise in bond yields.
So, it's important to look at some of the numbers on the table. So the central government has a gross borrowing program of 12 lakh crores. We expect states will be somewhere in the vicinity of 8 lakh crores. So you're looking at 20 lakh crores of gross borrowing. If you deduct all maturities, which probably you should not, because gross borrowing entails absorption of duration. But even if you deduct maturities, you are roughly looking at a net borrowing program, which is in the vicinity of 15 lakh crores. Now, just the 3 lakh crore odd of OMOs, whether it be through GSAP or some other route, is clearly not enough. Because bear in mind, FPI or foreign participation in India has been negligible or negative for the last few years. So basically, if the bond market were to absorb 15 lakh minus 3 lakh, around 12 lakh crores of supply on its own, it's a very, very tall task for the bond market. So clearly, the RBI has to do more than just the 3 lakh crores that they may do under some sort of a GSAP program. And that is how we would look at their purchase of treasury bills. So you're right. That is basically ammunition to do more of Operation Twist. What we also think would be a good idea is to further extend the held to maturity dispensations that have been given to banks. So let's say extend it to the next 4 or 5 years, so that that amount or that limit can be utilized to purchase more government bonds.
Hmm.
Having said all of this, it clearly is the view that yields are still going to go up. And this is the most important point, rather than the small technicalities of the bond market that investors need to realize. Now, when the yield curve is so steep, so just to put some numbers on the table, and these are just indicative, tentative numbers around an illustrative example, your overnight rate is 335. Roughly a 6 to let's say 5.5 to 6 year government bond is in the zone of 6%. So somewhere between 590 to 6%. Let's round it off for convenience sake to say 6%. So there is a so overnight at 335, bond at 6%. It gives you the difference between the two at 2.65%, which is 6 minus 3.35, right? Now that translates into 2 rupees and 65 paisa per year of excess returns that you make by not carrying cash, but by carrying that bond. Now let's round it off to 2.5 rupees.
Correct.
Now roughly the duration on this bond will be 5, which means that if the yield on the bond goes up by 50 basis point over the course of a year, 50 basis into 5, you will lose 2.5 rupees, which means you will still make as much as you make on the overnight. So this is just, so let me clarify, this is not a suggestion to buy 5-year bonds with a 1-year view. This is just an illustrative example to show you how much protection is built because of the steepness of the curve. So historically, many cycles have bottomed out at a flat yield curve. So even if you were to think about what the yield curve used to be, let's say 3 or 4 years back, from memory, I'm assuming overnight to 5-year would have been 50-60 basis points. Now that flat and yield curve means that if yields are going up, you have nowhere to hide.
Correct.
But today there is a 250 basis point steepness between 0 to 5 to 6 years. And that is the cushion you have as a bond investor. So the question really is not that bond yields are going to go up. Of course, they are going to go up. The question is how much should they go up per annum, per year, so that it still makes sense to invest in that as compared to carrying cash. So which is why we have, our view has been that some amount of medium duration kind of strategies, which are focused in, let's say 3 to 5 year area, is probably not a very bad way to think about the market because of the protection that is embedded here. And again, let me clarify, the example did not mean that you should invest in these strategies with a 1-year view. You have to invest with a 3+ year view. The example was only given to quantify the kind of cushion that is available. So the risk to this is that if bond yields go up very speedily, so for example, if bond yields go up by, let's say 100 basis points over 1.5 years, then obviously holding cash is the best thing. So again, we have seen many investors thinking about the market in a way that, oh, if yields are going up, let's not do anything. That's not true when the curve is so steep. So you can actually do a bit of barbelling, which means that you have very short assets, and then you have intermediate duration assets in the 3 to 5 year area, so that on aggregate, your duration does not go up substantially, or it's the same as you used to have before. But you don't then worry too much about rates going up as long as they don't go up very sharply. So that is the thing that you have to keep in mind when doing this. And I hope we get a chance to talk about asset allocation also, and you can plug these kinds of strategies in a core satellite framework, which is one of our favorite things to talk about in the bond market. But I'll leave that for a further question.
Right. So Suyash, with this, what would your advice be for investors who are evaluating the debt market? Where do you see opportunities on the long end of the yield curve?
So let me then quickly talk about the framework. And it's something that we talk about all the time, and I'm sure if people who are attending this call, if they have attended previous calls of ours, I would sound like a bit of a broken record on this, but we have always spoken about fixed income investing in terms of an asset allocation table which has 3 buckets: liquidity, core, and satellite. Now, liquidity bucket is for your cash management needs, where we largely, you would be buying a liquid fund or overnight fund, so you keep that aside. Your investment in fixed income is essentially core and satellite. Now, by core, we mean products that take a constrained amount of duration and credit risk. So here you would probably buy products which are largely AAA and government bond oriented strategies, but with an average maturity that typically, let's say, does not exceed 3 to 4 years, or maybe maximum 5 years. Whereas in the satellite bucket, you take higher amount of duration or higher amount of credit risk, right? So in the satellite bucket, you buy products like credit risk funds, dynamic bond funds, gilt funds, etc. Now, typically, because even in a gilt fund, there's high amount of duration risk. So the positioning is on both credit and duration risk. Now, typically, a conservative investor would have 60 to 70% in the core bucket, where, to repeat, largely you have products which are AAA and government bond oriented, and maturities ranging from let's say 3 6 months all the way to 3 4 years, right? Now, if you think about asset allocation in these terms, there is no need to have a continuous action bias, right? So fixed income is largely meant for protection and for giving some stability of return. So 60 70 goes there, and probably 30 goes in the satellite bucket. Your question about long duration, so long duration strictly belongs in the satellite bucket, and you should only buy as much of it as you can digest. The other point, however, is from a view standpoint, we don't necessarily see too much value in long duration, because if you see, fiscal is a multi-year risk for now. So it's not just this year or last year, but over the next 3 or 4 years, fiscal is going to be higher than usual, and therefore bond supply is going to be higher than usual. So I can't find a case currently for long-term yields to actually be falling anytime in the foreseeable future, which is the next 2 or 3 years. However, intermediate duration, which is bonds in the, let's say, up to 6 7 year area, actually offer reasonable carry for the duration risk that you run in those bonds. So again, that illustrative example that I referred to can be used to just run those numbers in your mind. But the only thing is that you should only be thinking about strategies with a 3+ year horizon. So for example, I don't see too much merit in people buying, let's say, a constant maturity product, right? Because like I said, it doesn't look like that there is any case for long-term yields to be falling in the next few years, but there is definitely probably a case for buying roll down products. So it could be done through index strategies, it could be done through shorter term roll down funds, the only or through active duration funds as well. The only thing, again, to reiterate over there, is that any product where at the point of entry you are running a maturity which is greater than 3 4 kind of years should be in the satellite bucket. Now, whether it is 3 or 4 or 5, that is a bit of a judgment call. But what I'm saying is that, so for example, we have done 2 index products, right? One is a 6 year and the other is a 7 year product. I would argue that these are actually satellite bucket allocations for you, because at the point of entry, you're running a 6 year maturity risk in the product. So as long as you are clear that you're buying products with the characteristics of core and satellite, that 60 70% of your allocation is actually going to conservative products with a maturity that ranges between, let's say, 6 months to 3 4 years. And when you're buying a 3 4 year product, even in the core bucket, you should buy it with a minimum 2 to 3 year horizon. I think you are okay. The problem is that we start thinking about fixed income very tactically, right? So as an example, let's say dynamic bond funds have earned a very bad name for themselves, that they never make money for clients. That is actually not true. So if you were to see 3 and 5 year rolling horizons for dynamic bond funds, some of the well-run funds have actually done quite well. The problem that happens is twofold. One is that these products are looked at tactically for shorter time horizons, and invariably people enter looking at historical returns, which is largely at probably the bottom of a rate cycle. So, the experience from there on is not that pleasant. And second, they don't, restrict how much of investments they are making over there. So if you were to look at the dynamic bond fund as a satellite bucket strategy, which means that never more than 20 to 30% of your allocation goes there. And if you think about buying into that kind of a product strategy with a minimum 3+ year horizon, it's very unlikely that your experience is going to be very, very bad. So ultimately, it is largely about the core satellite asset allocation table. And remember, the name of the fund means nothing. So you can find a banking PSU fund which is full of additional tier 1 bonds. You can find another banking PSU funds that is buying AAA and government bonds. You can find a medium term fund which is a credit oriented fund. You can find a medium term fund which is largely government bond oriented or corporate bond oriented. So you have to basically look at the portfolio. You have to see that the amount of credit and duration risk being run in the product, and accordingly think of it as a core or a satellite allocation.
That's an interesting take that you've given us, Suyash. But very lastly, how do you see the F5 movement in the bond market in India? Because clearly, recently we had, FTSE Russell, which placed the Indian government securities on its watch list for inclusion in its emerging market government bond index. Now, do you think this is something which would entail flow from foreign investors into India? Or simultaneously, we're even looking at the kind of liquidity position and the way bond deals are moving in the US. That's telling us that probably there could be a pullout that could happen from the Indian equity markets getting into the debt. So, how are you seeing this entire scenario?
So I don't really think that debt and equity flows move in fungible fashions. Typically I think those sets of flows are kind of distinct to each other. Unfortunately, as far as the fixed income markets are concerned, for the last few years, we have lost favor from FPIs. So FPIs have been largely absent or been exiting the market. Now, it could partly be owing to the fact that India's macro story has been slightly weak over the last 2-3 years. So there have been, various drivers for growth that have weakened. It is quite possible that we are re-emerging from those cyclical drivers, that some of those cyclical drivers are turning around for us. And so obviously now the COVID disruption is something that one has to contend with, but on its own, over a period of time, probably India's credit profile may have been looked at more positively. But obviously for this COVID wave that we are currently embattling. That said, for FPI money to on its own start coming meaningfully in India does not look like a near-term prospect. You referred to some bond index inclusions. Now that also depends on which index and to what quantum. For the current financial year, the bond market is largely not factoring in any sort of index oriented money entering the bond market. And therefore, we are largely relying on the RBI supporting the market to whatever extent they can. But again, it serves to be very clear that the RBI is definitely not trying to defend a certain level of yield. All they are trying to do is that the evolution of the curve should be methodical, which means yields can go up, provided they don't go up in a disruptive fashion. And again, it serves to be clear about is that when the yield curve is so steep, intermediate duration points are also offering a very substantial carry, and therefore you can afford to invest even with a view that yields are going to rise, provided they don't rise so sharply that all the excess carry that you make gets wiped out.
Absolutely. I think that's an interesting take, Suyash, that you've given us so far. Thank you so much for joining us on the show. It was a pleasure to have you and speak to you. And I think everyone has enjoyed the conversation as well. I hope you enjoyed the conversation too. And we will speak to you soon again. Thank you. Stay safe.
Thank you so much. Thanks.